It's interesting actually because 2 or 3 years ago, when the Rio crop turned over, at that point most people were staying in the international amateur setup anyway for I wouldn't say too long, but till mid 20s, most of them anyway. Some of them a little bit later than that. But over the last year or so, not just this year with the pandemic, but the last 2 years maybe, we're having quite a lot more turnover with very little senior experience who've done well as juniors and youths and decided to take the plunge straight away. So it'll be interesting to see how you could kind of compare those two routes. There were obvious differences in that the later you turn over, the less time you had to make mistakes, basically. But yeah, it's just something that struck me over the last few months.
I mean, this is Andy. We talk about it a lot. I think it's quite relevant, so I'll come in here because Matthew's a good person to kind of speak to about it as well. Me and you chat a lot about it, you know. And in recent weeks, we were talking about Hunter Ben, how people want, and I'm like, you can't compare someone who's 25 years old, turning pro with 300 amateur fights behind him, you know, to someone like Conor Ben, who's had 20 fights in Australia, probably not really taking it serious. You know, he turned pro at 19. Who knows where he might be? Do you know what I mean? Because the rate of improvement, there's going to be so much. We don't know what the ceiling is there. You know, someone who's already had 300 amateur fights, who's 25 years old, turning pro, he's going to get better. He's going to adjust and adapt to 12 rounds, etc. But so I'm not going to say he's the finished article, but you know, the rate of improvement that he's got to go isn't going to be that great, as opposed to someone who's 18 years old. But you see something in the kid, whether it's a desire, whether it's his explosiveness, whatever it may be. You just think, all right, this kid's a bit raw, but he's got the raw materials. He's got to put it all together, and he's got to develop and improve and learn. But you can teach skills, you can teach drills, and you can teach technique. You can't put what God left out. You can't give someone balls. You can't give them explosive power. You can't give them a good chin. Do you know what I mean? These are things that you cannot give. But if you can see that in someone, and he's only 18 years old, and maybe he's half been playing with the game or whatever the reason might be, you might think this kid isn't on the GB setup. He's not going to go to the Olympics. But you know what? Let's turn him pro and let's take our time. Let's, you know, you've got the right experienced people guiding the kid's career. They'll pick the right fights at the right time, keep him busy, keep him in the gym. You don't need distractions. You don't need loads of time out of the gym where bullshit can happen. Stay focused, you know. And if you're someone that's experienced in the game, you'll know that kid turning pro at 18. You're talking, it's a 5-year plan anyway, at least, to where you see this kid going into his, you know, where you're going, I'm not going to say go into a 50-55, but we're going to roll the dice a little bit. If a kid's 18, 19 and he hasn't had hundreds of amateur fights, that's a 5-year plan, at least, where you're thinking, right, I know where he is now, but I know where we want to see him in 5 years. And then you've got to break that 5 year down to years, 6 months, and then it's fight by fight. And you just want to see those little gains. And as long as it's moving in the right direction, like I say, we mentioned Conor Ben just because it's someone that's in the limelight recently. But and me and Andy have done a lot of his fights, Matt, and I've been watching him close now, but he is a completely different fighter to what he was 3-4 years ago. Where's he going to be in another 3 years? If he can box, if he can have 4 or 5, let's say 4 fights a year, if he can have 4 fights a year over the next 3 years, that's 12 fights, injuries permitting, etc. And he'll be 27 then, in his physical prime, let's say. Who knows how good he might be? He could be a completely different fighter than what he is now. And Matthew talking there about Campbell, you know, you got to remember Matthew and Ricky, they're massively successful in their own careers. You know, you'll be. I'm pretty sure you'll be conscious of pressures that Campbell might have and living up to, and all this sort of bullshit that people make comparisons. Let the kid find his own feet. But if he really wants to do it, well, look, he ain't going to look any further than to have the 2 best people guiding his career in his dad and his uncle. Do you know what I'm saying? So I'm going to be fascinated watching Campbell, but I've got to say, it didn't half make me feel old watching him.
Oh, and again, Matt, you know, sees things exactly like me. It depends on the fighter as well, and the, you know, their ambitions. You do get some amateurs, some top amateurs, and they're looking towards the Olympic Games and stuff like that. That's never been the case for Campbell. I've never heard him mention about going to. He's always wanted to turn professional. That's where, and he is better suited. to the professionals. You know, like Matt touched on there, the sports are very, very different, amateur boxing and professional boxing. And a lot of the characteristics that Matt touched on there, Campbell has in abundance. You know, technically he still needs quite a lot of work. But the biggest thing with Campbell, he's got a lot of heart, a lot of determination, physically strong, very good body punch and attractive style to watch. So like Matt touched on there, with someone who's had 300 amateur fights, it's very difficult to mold somebody because they've already set in the ways of how they like to do things. Again, you can make adjustments. But with Campbell, like he won the novices, he won the national novice title. He went from there to being struggled who to match him with, really. And last year he boxed a couple of really good lads, over 70, 80 fights, only lost a handful, losing in great fights, you know, split decisions and stuff like that. So Campbell is better suited to the pros. I always used to say to him, you know, when he was just falling short in the amateurs, you know, against really experienced guys, don't use that as an excuse, Campbell. You know, you will be better suited to the pros, but you've got to win these fights. But in reality, Campbell is better suited to the pros. Like I say, technically he still needs a lot of work, and a lot of guys that turn professional early, sometimes they're lacking a bit of strength, you know, toughness. Campbell doesn't lack in those departments. So it's more technical work that Campbell needs.
It's really interesting to see the both kind of schools, if you like, come through. Because I really enjoy amateur boxing, really enjoy watching the top international tournaments and see them come through. It's great. But I also do really enjoy watching a fighter turn pro young who's been bred for pro boxing. Me and Matt did Zelfa Barrett's fight against Eric Donovan, for example. And Zelfa is a really good example of that. Pat Barrett has bred him for pro boxing. We've seen a lot of James Tennyson, and he was a good amateur up in Belfast. But again, you watch how he fights, and he was always bred for pro boxing. They go in there and they look for, they're looking to take you out. You know, they're not necessarily going to be gung-ho about it. They'll do it in an educated way, but they've got to make sure they don't get too impatient. It might come in the 12th round, it might come in the second round, but you know, you can see a big difference there a lot of the time in the two different styles. But I was thinking to myself, it must, when you train your Campbell at the minute and have been for the last few months, it must kind of make you laugh sometimes when you see someone or any kid in the gym who's really fresh and, you know, bright-eyed, and they're loving the training, they're loving everything about boxing. They've turned over pro, they've done their medicals, they're just loving life, and boxing is just the best thing in the world. And you must sometimes just kind of laugh at yourself and just think, whoa, wow, you don't know the half of it.
Well, yeah, you know, I've always been very close with Campbell, and I think the world of Campbell. And, you know, when you're training a fighter, you spend a lot of time with them, you know, a lot of time with them. And I always think you have to like the people that you train because you spend so much time with them. And Campbell, again, you know, biased, of course, because he's my nephew, but he's such a fun kid. You know, people are going to learn more and more about Campbell as he goes on, but he's such a character and good fun to have around the gym. And one thing I like about Campbell, what's refreshing these days, you know, I've been coaching quite a long time now, and a lot of these fighters that come through, they don't seem to have the mental toughness or the desire and the hunger. Maybe I'm being unfair here as fighters, like in mine and Matt's days, that's something that I've certainly seen. And I think it's because, like say, myself and me and Matt have boxed at the very top level. We know what it takes to get there. We know the sacrifices you have to make. And it is frustrating when you don't see that in kids these days, which tends to happen more and more. You call them Instagram boxers. They're more bothered about what they look like on Instagram rather than getting down there, putting the work in. But Campbell's got a great attitude to training, and that can only stand him in good stead. But great fun to be around in the gym. I really enjoy working with him.